people is tired of being broken, being poor, being the victim in the story.
You only control 50% of it. You can only control your half of the interview. You just have to go in and see what you get.
Welcome to our panel, Human-to-Human, Interviewing Across Disciplines. This is an event for the Digital Humanities Consortium here at Cal Poly Pomona. My name is Rachel Tamar Mann. I teach in the history department. I am an early Americanist by trade here, but I work in family history, and so I get to do a lot of oral history interviews through that. And I had the very strange experience of having my first job out of undergraduate being a survey researcher for the University of California Survey Research Center. And so I did sociological research for them, going out and doing a number of different kinds of surveys. And one of the things that I find fascinating is how different the different best practices, guidelines, ethics of different fields of interviewing are. And we tend to think of interviewing as being one thing, but in fact it's many things. And so I'm really excited to have folks here together to discuss this. And a second reason I just wanted to actually push in here is we've been talking a lot for the Digital Humanities Consortium and on campus and kind of everywhere. We've been talking a lot about AI, everything, everywhere, all at once. It's all about artificial intelligence, and I kind of liked the fact that interviewing is about that human-to-human contact. And so actually turning around and saying like, okay, what can we actually learn from each other? What do we learn from interviewing? So I wanted us to go ahead and start off by allowing each of us to introduce ourselves. And if I could trouble you to go ahead and give your name, your field, and your interviewing background.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Lauren Fury. I'm an associate professor in the communication department and the advisor of the Poly Post student newspaper. Thank you. So my experience in interviewing comes from being a journalist in the field. I have a lot of experience doing interviews. Also, I co-host my own podcast and so interview people that way. So plus in research capacities as well. It's all kind of very different, and there's a lot of different strategies and things you should and should not do in the different settings. So excited to share that with you guys today.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Denise Vasquez Guevara. I'm also in the communications department, but in the division of PR. And my background is mostly in Latin American studies, qualitative research, and participatory action research. Most likely in these frames in science communication and health communication, which are my fields, is for co-constructing solutions around health, but also how to translate complex scientific data into initiatives for people. So, for example, how you can turn a public health issue into a tool that comes from research so people can use it in different ways. So for that perspective, we're using mostly in-depth interviews, but also conversational interviewing, which are techniques that are used, for example, in settings such as the MIT and other technologies, but also for co-designing stuff, such as UX technologies.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francisco Bertrand. I'm an assistant professor of history. This is my second year here at Cal Poly Pomona. My fields are in Chicanx, Latinx history, race and ethnicity, borderlands history, immigration, and oral history. And a lot of the work that I've done in terms of interviewing have been doing one-on-one interviews with members of the Mexican-American Chicano and Chicano community to learn about their histories of activism, specifically in my hometown of San Diego during the 60s and 70s, primarily to learn about, in what ways did local Spanish-speaking communities contribute to the larger civil rights movement era of the 60s and 70s. And I was particularly interested in learning about the different political and social ideas that informed their type of work out in the community, whether it be by using a cultural nationalist empowerment idea or working with the two main political parties. So I used the interviews as a way to learn more about the diversity of the ethnic Mexican community, but also to have a bigger picture of the multicultural landscape that is the Southwest Borderlands, which is my primary area of research.
No mic, huh? Okay. So my name is Brady Collins. I'm a professor of political science, but my background's a little bit all over the place. I did my PhD in urban planning and was a part of something called the Urban Humanities Initiative at UCLA, which sought to use, film, literature, oral history as kind of means to examine the city. And I was trained as an ethnographer, but, do a lot more kind of participatory action research now, mainly looking at working conditions in low-wage industries in Los Angeles. And so that means interviewing people when they're on the job or off the job in kind of precarious and vulnerable situations. And then I've also been doing this podcast now for CCP for 5 years now and have been figuring out how to make podcasts, which is its own kind of interviewing practice. So
to say just really quick, give the plug for the course CCP.
For the course?
No, well, you can if you want to.
So apply now.
For next semester.
For next semester, CCP chooses an annual theme every year. Somebody teaches a seminar on it, and we make a podcast on that topic if you're in the class. And so I'll be teaching next year, and it's on the future of work. So apply now.
It's the California Center for Ethics and Policy.
Sorry, yes. CCEP, California Center for Ethics Policy. A cousin of the Digital Humanities Consortium, I guess I would say.
We're very close cousins.
Yeah, they're related. So that's me.
Yeah. Nice. All right, so we're going micless, so I hope everybody can hear us okay. I actually want us to step back in time here and think about in terms of training, of how you were trained into your field. And I was actually wondering if you had maybe a story of something that either is something that surprised you in being trained into your field, or something that you think that people outside of your field would be surprised to know about the training for your field.
I think training for interviewing in journalism happens all the time. Like, it's in every journalism class you take, you're going to be doing interviews. So you're going to be constantly trained about it. But I think the part to remember is you only control 50% of it. You can only control your half of the interview. Like, some people, you'll go in and there'll be great conversations and they'll have a lot to say. And some people will give you 1 to 2 word answers. And ultimately, a journalist relies on interviews to tell the stories that they're assigned and pitched to do. Most of the information that comes from journalistic stories is through the process of interviewing. So you have to be good at it to tell a story. But at the end of the day, you can only control so much. Like, just some interviews are going to go great, some aren't. And you have to learn strategies for getting people to talk if they don't talk enough. You have to get strategies of bringing people back on topic if they go in the wrong direction, or just shut down a conversation, or if someone's going off of PR speak, or really sticking to a script and they're not getting at what you really want. You have to be able to get people to drop the facade and answer the questions in the way that is genuine and true. So there's lots of different scenarios, and you can talk about the different problems you can encounter, but at the end of the day, you just have to go in and see what you get, and then kind of adjust depending on the type of situation that you're in.
It's kind of a seasoning process.
Yes.
Of learning how to
It's eventually you just get, you should go in prepared no matter what. It's I tell students, it's better to have a roadmap than not. You should go in with a list of questions that you're going to ask. You should do as much research on the person you're interviewing and the topic that you're covering beforehand as possible, and kind of work through possible scenarios that could happen and know how you're going to handle them. But ultimately, once you get there, you never know. And even depending on the type of situation, if you're going to go and interview someone who just was a victim of a crime, it's very different than if you're going to go interview a politician or the CEO of a major company, or if you're going to go to an event and have to walk up to people and interview them in the field. There's a whole bunch of different strategies, so you just kind of have to be prepared and lots of practice and writing different types of stories so you get that variety of experience.
Well, in my case specifically, I come from a strategic communication background as undergrad and master's, but I decided in my doctoral studies to go into an unexplored field, which is science communication, which is still booming right now. But it was pretty much a very broad interdisciplinary training, which took me to a Latin American studies background in New Mexico, which is interesting because I'm from Latin America, I'm from Ecuador, but there's two traditions in science communication, which is pretty much a deficitarian perspective of always academics, talking to people, and what people hate is being talked down. Like, I'm teaching you, you don't know anything. People don't know, cannot understand science. It's what's keeping this breach, this ivory tower effect. So the new wave of the last decade, at least, is public engagement. And public engagement has a completely different epistemology, which is co-constructing of knowledge. And co-constructing of knowledge comes from indigenous scholars, comes from Latin American scholars, and how you build in community and in participation a tool from knowledge. Like, I don't know, the pandemic, how we learn to take care of ourselves and our families and together from the pandemic, how we organize this. So many techniques, for example, in-depth interviewing in one-on-one with experts, like how are you building your research? What pain points do you have when you want to do your interventions with people? What are you willing to do or not willing to do? And also exploring in-depth, iterative, a lot why and the reasons why and behind, and also providing a safe space for them to talk, So some conversations have to stay confidential because people don't want their identities out there, but also in research protocols and grants, which is how you develop this type of work, you have to have IRB. So the interview, like institutional review board, or the bioethics committees, as we call it in Latin America. So all of those, you have to protect your sources because you cannot put in a paper sensitive information, say about somebody, even if it's somebody that comes from privilege, or somebody that doesn't come from privilege, even worse, right? Like, because you can make them vulnerable in different ways. So how you protect the sources, but also how you listen things that are completely out, like you're completely opposite to it. How you interview a person that has a completely different ideology, who doesn't want to talk to you, who believes your work is not valuable, at least give you a minute to talk to them, and how to get the information out there. So in my perspective, I learned many conversational techniques in order to get that information, but also people knowing they're going to be interviewed. So not like extracting information like a spy or something like that. No, but rather the co-construction. So, okay, this is your problem, but how we solve it? Do you know what that problem is happening? And so it's a conversation, like back and forth, and testing out how they feel about specific things. But in groups, which is participatory action research, such as Dr. Collins Brady talked here to us today, it's very important to know that you are co-constructing knowledge. You're not the owner of that knowledge. So if you go with a community and you create a piece with them, such a fanzine, or you create like a campaign or a tool for them to do something, the knowledge that comes from your authorship has to be co-shared. You come with your layers of knowledge of science, but they have the life experience. So you have to acknowledge also their contribution to the piece. So I have co-authored pieces with people from the community, from grassroots groups. Okay, we co-created this cookbook, or we co-created these. There's a piece we did for LASA many years ago, which was a resilience strategy for online bullying for feminists advocating in Latin America. So the piece was out there, set for the training, but the co-authorship of that paper in LASA was them and I was second author because they had all the strategies. We just facilitated the organization and the training. So you have to know when to step aside. And the best participatory action research is when you act as a tool of facilitation, but the solution stays with the people. So they have the agency of it, and your purpose is facilitating that and then walking out and leading them to keep implementing the solutions on themselves. So know how to not be codependent, but also how to surrender your knowledge, and also knowing what's your authorship and what's not your authorship.
So for me, my initial training in oral history actually came during the process of doing oral history interviews. The way that I entered some of my initial interviews for some school papers that I had was I wanted to learn something about my community. So that was my guiding question. So then I would enter these conversations, or I would enter these interviews as a way to learn about my own community's history. So I always thought it in a way of I'm sitting down, somebody is sharing their time with me. I'm going to be respectful of their time and learn, something that I want to expand my knowledge about. So like has been previously said, as I was doing several of these interviews to learn about Mexican American history in San Diego, I prepared a set of questions, but then I was through experience, I figured that interviews don't never go the way that you expect them to. They were going to go in numerous different directions, and that's usually, in my case, that's been a good thing. Because then some of the questions might open up memories or additional knowledge that the interviewees, in this case, I'm asking community members about things they did 50 years ago. And I mean, sometimes it's hard enough to remember what you ate in the morning for breakfast, let alone, what did you do 50 years ago? Like, what did you write an article 50 years ago that talks about protesting unequal education in a local community school? So as I kept doing my interviews, because I was looking at different community newspapers, I would bring copies of the newspapers that I found, or that I made digital copies of from numerous university archives, and would bring them, have the interviewees review them. Sometimes doing a group interview would actually work better because they could build off of each other's points and say, like, do you remember writing this? Like, oh no, actually, if you remember, we were going out that night to do some type of a meeting, and this is when we decided to say this. So they were, bouncing off information from one another. And as a person right there, I would just, let them talk because I'm learning. And in some cases, they would answer my questions, but in the process, I'm coming up with follow-up questions to build off of different points. And these are some of the strategies that I've passed on to my students over the years, as a way to learn about community history, because there is a long history of manipulation of narratives, of co-opting stories, being used for purposes that were not meant to be used. So you have to always build that trust with the community members, especially if you're seen as an outsider within that community scope. In my case, I was viewed as as an insider, as some scholars would say. So I'm part of that community, but there's still some challenges to navigate in those terrains as well. So for me, it's been about learning community stories, family stories. So very much so in the way that you would engage in a conversation with a parent, with a grandparent, with an uncle or an aunt or a neighbor, and just talk about the different things and what is the memory of a person, or how does a person remember the past, and how did it affect them directly. That's always been my guiding feature, to talk about how the past is remembered differently by different groups of people, and each set of memory tells us something unique. In this case, about race and ethnicity in the U.S., immigration experiences, or just what is the United States, if not the coming together of multiple ideas and perspectives in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of training, right? That was a question. I'm actually, I think, envious of the journalist background and the ability to think about how you approach an interview and different audiences, because I don't think I got any of that training. My methodological professor was a Marxist sociologist, and her thing was if you aren't careful, the way that you conduct the interview will actually just reinforce systems of oppression and perpetuate harm. And like day one in class, she said that, and I was like, "What? Okay, what am I?" But you know, you see it as Denise was saying. Oftentimes, the scholarly community has this very kind of extractive relationship to the subjects that they're interviewing, where they kind of come in with their magnifying glass for a little bit of time, get what they need, and they leave. And that you know is actually a really problematic way of doing research and producing knowledge. So you know, I was taught to always think about the power relationship between you, the researcher, and those that you're researching, and to do whatever you can to try to embed yourself in their lives prior to conducting an interview. And that's kind of part of the ethos behind the participatory action research, is like they are the scholars themselves, and that helps dismantle some of that. But all of that takes a ton of time. It's not something I would say most graduate students even kind of have easy access to. So you kind of fumble through it and figure it out as you go. And I think I had to learn the actual skills of like how to talk to people in a meaningful way, like just doing it, and was really bad. And I think I got better, but like that's was a learning process.
Yeah. So I actually want us to like take this and actually kind of like in terms of thinking about starting an interview, or even like before the interview even starts, do you have ideas or advice in terms of setting the tone and building that rapport and that trust, whether it's in terms of like thinking about location, thinking about like other ways, things that you do to help actually build a sense of rapport with people that you want to interview?
I don't always have to start.
I was thinking
I can, but I don't have to start.
I feel like the microphone actually kind of like predisposes me to look
like,
directly to you.
That's fine. I mean, I'm happy to. Like, it depends on who you're interviewing. Like,
yes.
If you are a student journalist, as an example, and you are talking to a major politician, let's say, you're going to need to like establish your rapport and your knowledge like right out the gate. You're going to want to ask, you want your first question to be like, I've done my research, I know my stuff, and like you should take me seriously. But then if you're interviewing like someone in the community who's never been interviewed before, you might sit down and like if you ask like a hard-hitting question, they're going to immediately like shut down and close yourself off to you. So you might have to start with like, hey, like I'm just a normal person. Like, what are you streaming on Netflix? Like, you know, just to like talk about something off topic, just to kind of show that you're a human being. Or even it might be that you have to explain how an interview works and like what you're gonna do with it. You might have to explain like, hey, like I'm gonna be quoting you with the purpose to put it in a news story and publish it. And you might have to explain parameters like off the record and on the record and like how that works. And but ultimately it's technically the person being interviewed's responsibility to set those terms. And as a journalist, they do not have to teach you that if they don't want to. Like it's expected that if you're, you know, you've been interviewed all the time, like a journalist is going to come and be like, okay, so this is how on the record, off the record works. Like it might be that if you think it's, you know, you're talking to someone about something sensitive and you want to, you know, kind of show that you are there to protect them and like hear their story. And, you know, if like you're talking to a victim or something like that, you might be much more delicate in how you approach that versus someone who should know better. And, you know, but then you might want to establish your rapport and like, yeah, I know my stuff, because I know I've had interviews I've done where the person has called my office after and been like, did she know what she was talking about? Like, I mean, I've had those experiences, and any journalist you'll have experiences where, you know, you drop the ball and the interview stinks and it's like, well, okay, that was not great. But then also people just sometimes, like I've had people who didn't take me seriously just because I'm a woman and like questioned, like I had someone who literally said, you write slower than men. How do I know you're going to get the story right? And I was like, cool, let me show you that I write a really good story and you can have a right to ask for a correction if I get it wrong, which they did not do. So I got it right. But like, you know, so you have to kind of decide, do I need to establish my rapport So they take me seriously? Do I need to like make someone relax so this can actually be a conversation that's meaningful? So it kind of depends on the type of situation that you're in.
I will say, one of the things I find so fascinating about this is like it's the opposite of oral history in terms of the ethics of it, in terms of the ethos and the whose responsibility is it to make sure that you know the rules of the game?
Yeah.
And is it the person who's been interviewed, or is it the interviewer? And in oral history, it is all on the interviewer. It's just that there's a very large sense of responsibility there.
No, like, I mean, we have to know what those parameters are. So like if someone does say it's off the record, you stop taking notes. Because like if you do put something in your story that's off the record, you're going to get sued and they're going to win, so there's a legal concern there. But if at the end of the day, if they like tell you something and then go, whoops, I'm sorry, I meant to say that's off the record, it's fair game. Like you can publish it. You don't have to, depending on what they told you. But if they have to set that parameter in advance, and it's up to them to know that, not on the journalist. I mean, I think when you're interviewing a member of the community, like as an ethical issue, I think it's important to teach people as a journalist, if you think that it's someone who should know that, but like if someone should know better, you don't need to talk about that. It kind of depends on the person you're interviewing.
Yeah.
Well, in my case, it's a little bit different because we have to prepare and do self-reflexivity before entering a space, right? Like it doesn't matter where you're going, you have to make a reflection of who you are in relation to where are you going. Am I going to talk about with a scientist? In my case, like disclose to myself, not to anybody else, my positionality, my identity, and how I position myself in front of this person could be like a researcher that never has done science communication and wants to do it, but doesn't know how. But my identity as a woman of color, immigrant in the United States, how that person's going to receive me and prepare for it. I have to be prepared to be questioned. I have to be prepared if there's pushback, and how I'm going to proceed in a way that protects me, but also carries the goals of the research project, right? Also, how we position ourselves is one of the key things that you learn when you're trained as a field researcher in participatory action research, which is what I do, is use also the identity and work on yourself a lot. So it's a lot of self-psychological work and psychological work also with a professional, right? Because one of the good things, for example, in being a Latino or Latina doing science communication or doing participatory action research is we have this shared identity, such as Gloria Alzando, I used to say, right? Like we cross the border and we're home, but we cross the border and we're an immigrant and our privileges change depending on where position. But I'm part white, but I'm also part indigenous. So how I position myself, like my different nuances, how I use my different nuances to navigate that. How I make the other know that I am understanding enough and what are their limits and what are my limits with them. How we set the boundaries, but how I also respect those spaces. So I think self-reflexivity, like you have to acknowledge even the person has more privilege than you or you have more privilege than them, how you're going to navigate and negotiate that positionality. If you are the privileged person in situations such as a researcher, doesn't matter. If you have a level of education and you're going to interview somebody that's doing better than you in life, you have a layer of privilege. Doesn't matter if your race is the same, because nobody has, and not everybody has levels of education as you do. So you hold the power in knowledge. You hold the power in how that's going to be portrayed. Probably they don't even know how it's going to be portrayed. So how I do an ethical balance of all of that. So self-reflexivity is key. But one of the pieces that really, really changed my life when I was training for this is because personally, as a Latino researcher doing this, it annoys me and also makes me angry. I have to disclose this constant repetition, as Francisco say, of reproducing structures of power and hurt. And for example, I'm work in Latin America, people is tired of being broken, being poor, being the victim in the story. Like, people is tired of that. How we thrive beyond that. Like, how we overcome that. That's part of history and has to be acknowledged, but it's not all we are. We're more than that, right? We have capabilities, we have social capital, we have many things to do and contribute to the table. How we use that to move on forward, to make something that overcomes these structures. Because you can choose as a researcher to reproduce the damage, which is a piece, for example, that I learned from an indigenous scholar called Eve Tuck. That's actually, the piece is called Suspending Damage. So how you suspend the damage of constant, like the poorness, the brokenness, the colonization. Yes, that's true. It happened. We're a product of that. I always joke with my students, like, if colonization never happened, I'll be happy in the Andes, hanging out with my llama, right? I will love that. Like, that, see me where I'm talking a language that's not mine. Sometimes I make mistakes. I get lost. I hate driving this horrible I-10. Right? I hate it, but I'm having a new opportunity. So how I navigate that, right? So it happened. I cannot change. I cannot call McFly and say, let's back to the past and like send Columbus back to Spain. I cannot do that. I wish I could. Like, send a wave and like, woof, get out, right? But anyways, that never happened. That's what happens in my mind. But anyway, how we navigate those difficulties and how we position ourselves. So this piece of Eve Tuck talks how damaging is that. Oh, again, the poor. Okay, like, but people have dreams. People want to overcome this. People want to be better. People want to be different. So how you're an agent of change for the people that want to change. How you share your knowledge in this thing. Okay, this is the problem. What's your solution? We think we can do a club for the neighborhood watch to make it safer. Okay, how we make the club? Who's going to coordinate the club? Teach them capacity building, how they can facilitate the session with you. So for me, it has been great, like co-facilitating with a member of community and little by little walking out to a point they kick me out. So like, and then I come back and say, oh, we're doing great. Okay, wonderful, bye. Like, so later it's like, do you guys want to do a panel? Do you want to do a paper? Want to do something? Oh, yeah, we want to do, but now this is us. Perfect. You succeed because they don't need you anymore. Imagine a whole dependency of interventions. Mm-hmm. You don't have a life for it. So, yeah.
For me, actually, when I started doing my oral history interviews in a way to establish that sense of trust, I always think back to a graduate seminar that I took with one of my PhD advisors, and he had us read a book by an author that wrote in a very, let's put it, very shitty way. He wrote really bad. So I tried to read it. I don't think I got to the first 2 chapters. I didn't read the rest. So I went to class, not prepared, not like I tell my students this time. I always come prepared to class to discuss. But that time I went to class. It's like, why would he have us read something that was so bad? And he had a purpose to it. This is an example of how I don't want you to write. This is an example of how you try to sound smart without being smart. Mm-hmm. You're writing only for a specific audience. You're not writing for a wider audience. If you want your work to matter, to have relevance, to have real implications that can improve people's lives, you need to be clear up front. Use language that's accessible. Don't use a lot of academic jargon that a lot of people are going to say, what the fuck is this? I don't understand what this is. And that stayed with me, that lesson. That you want your work to matter, especially to the communities that you are working with, and that they're sharing their knowledge with you. So I've applied that in my own process for whenever I do an oral history, is that you want to be as upfront and clear to your potential interviewee. What is your project about? Why does it matter? How are they going to benefit from participating in this project? Like, what will they get out of giving time of their busy schedules to sit down with you and to learn, to share something with you. Now, how will this information then be shared? Is it just going to stay within the four walls of a classroom? Is it going to be part of an article that's going to be published somewhere? Is it going to be part of a presentation where the public is going to be able to engage in an event? So whenever I whenever I've done an interview, I'm always conscious to explain everything to my interviewee. Like, what are their rights? What are their benefits? What risks, if it's a topic that might lead to some sort of a negative consequences, and if there is, try to explain in what ways I can protect them. They don't have to disclose all information that they don't want to, especially because I deal with topics related to immigration, to racism, discrimination. So in many cases, those could lead to potential consequences if you don't know how to deal with these situations. Always give them the option of either going by their real name, picking a pseudonym, or being anonymous. When the interview is done, or after I ask for their consent to interview them and to record the interview, I sign a form letting them know, once I transcribe this, I will give you the transcript. You will get to review it. You will get to tell me what parts you want me to include and what I should take away, or maybe correct. It's also a way for me to make sure that I got their ideas correct, because whenever I write their stories into the work that I'm doing, I want to keep as much of their original ideas and their story be the one that anchors the entire the story that I'm doing. So I always upfront to them, and that's when I'm currently teaching a course on oral history, and the students in my class just completed writing a consent form. So they do a lot of this in their consent form, and it's tailored specifically towards the person whom they're going to interview. So they're coming up in a way that is, I'm coming from an educational setting, and I'm interested in learning about your life experiences because I want to learn this. This is significant because of this. So in a way, it places the interviewee as a history maker. And because history has not always been inclusive of every single person, every single community, oral history is one of those ways where you can begin to incorporate those stories. It follows in the long tradition of community stories being passed down in front of gatherings, or in the form of songs or poems. So it's part of that longer lineage. So for me, it's always been the advice that I give my students, and the one that I follow: be clear, be upfront. Don't come out as somebody who is here to, school the people who are you're interviewing with. No, in this case, you are the student, and they are your professor. They are your instructors. You are learning from them. So what is it about their story, that is going to help you also, but also how is it going to help them in the long term?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess everything that my panelists have said, I agree with. I guess I would just add that, I think really well-written interview questions go a long way. I think that's something I've worked a lot on. And yeah, we're doing interviews because we don't want to do surveys. And so I think there's a tendency starting out to write interview questions that could be answered with a survey questionnaire. And so really thinking about, the value of the interview is getting stories and getting them to describe feelings. And an example of this is last year, I was part of a project team that was, again, talking to workers in supermarkets about working conditions, and to get them to feel comfortable, of course, not talking to them when they were right outside the workplace was an important first step, trying to find another location to sit and have a conversation. But I think asking questions like, describe a time you felt scared that you were going to lose your job, or what does it feel like coming home after a 16-hour day of work, you know, and just having them describe the feeling in their body of like getting home after work and trying to relate to their family. I think that just generates responses that will be more open-ended, and they'll see that you're really interested, hopefully, in who they are as a human being and what their life is like. And then, of course, you know, things like body language and just, you know, not looking like, you know, just a pen in the paper all the time, but kind of like acknowledging and hearing them and looking them in the eye. So I think that's what I would add.
So I definitely want to come back to that in terms of like what makes a good question, because I do feel like that is a really, really important thing to consider. I wanted to pause and have us think about, there's some subtle differences that are showing up.
I was nodding during, yeah.
Yeah, but there are differences in based on our field and based on the goals of our fields that shape our best practices and shape the ethical guidelines for our field. And I would love to actually unpack more of that.
Yeah, I was nodding as you were, I was like nodding no, and you said like, oh, I show them the transcript at the end, and I was like, in journalism, no. Like, you cannot show them your notes. You cannot show them what you're going to quote. You cannot have them read your story in advance of publication. That is a big no. Like, they ask all the time. You will, if you're a journalist, you will ask, can I please read that story before you publish? No, you can't. Like, some people even try and set that up as a parameter before they agree to an interview. Yeah, I'll consent to an interview as long as I can read what you're going to write about me before it publishes. And that's the whole point. We can't show them, because then there's the temptation to control the narrative and make themselves sound better, or like adjust. Like, even some people just want to hear their quotes so they sound more professional or things like that. And that's just an ethical concern. So you should always verify. Like, if you have a question, like, hey, I'm not sure I got this down right. Like, can you verify this fact for me that I got it correct? Like, that's fine, but you should not show your story. You should not like show them which quotes you're going to use, because that's a big ethical, like, no. Now, granted, like, you do need to make sure though you get it right, and also you have to do a lot of judgment, because people will lie to you, and like, it happens. And if you publish a lie and it hurts someone's reputation in some way, you're going to be the one who got sued for it, not the person who said it, because they might have told you, but you're the one who made that lie public knowledge. So there are like legal concerns that you should always verify. You know, that's why you do lots of interviews with lots of different people. Like, when you start hearing the same answers, you know that like you're on the right track. But at the end of the day, like, you cannot show the person what you wrote about them, you know? So that is a very fundamental difference between like oral history and journalism. Mm-hmm.
I wonder like how much of these kinds of differences though are tied to that there are different goals, and like how what our fields are actually trying to do with interviews are actually, I mean, there's a lot of overlap. There are a lot of significant differences in there too.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, in my case, we do share the data, but it's not for public publication, but for co-construction of the solution. So it's like, when you say this, do you mean this or that? Like, so you have to co-explore how it's built, right? To make sure you're right, but also you have to fact check, because some people might be lying too. So, hey, like, remember what you told me the other day when we were talking about this? But there's this other thing that I found, so I'm not sure. So you not say like, hey, you're a liar. Like, no, like, so you don't want people to, feel you're attacking them. Just like, okay, like, what do you mean? Sometimes could be a misunderstanding too, right? So it's a co-construction, but also ethical practices, most likely, specifically in participatory action research, you have to be able to co-share. So how we do that, like, and to be open with information, we do lots of participatory diagramming, such as with, Mentimeters, for example, if it's digital and people have accessibility, or post-it notes on a board, on the floor. If people sometimes don't have ability to, like, literacy, we have done things such as voting on closed rooms with like beings or things like that. Like you have to imagine something that works and is familiar for them. So one of my favorite papers, for example, is from a vaccination campaign when they were developing the Gardasil 9 for HPV, but also the precursors of H1V, HIV, AIDS in Africa. They were trying to understand how women and how people got sick, like how they got infected through different, sexual practices, which is completely sensitive topic to ask people specifically in when societies are that close and so on. So what this researcher did is create closed rooms with diagrams, like divided like a grid. Okay, if you have infected through a raping situation, both with this stone, both with this being. So people were having sets of that, entering the room alone with no recording, and they were voting. Like, so in a diagram, how many people got sick this way, that way. And protecting. Because they couldn't read, they couldn't write, they need a translator for conduct the research. So you have to like be creative of how you're going to extract the information, how you are going to revisit the conversation in a confidential way so they don't feel you're asking them like too much or hurting them, but also having resources in case the topic is traumatizing, having a psychologist as part in the grant that you're doing in the funds, that they can provide the resources, the traumatizing experiences they might be talking so that person can get depressed. So having somebody on call, like, okay, this person today got triggered, give them a couple sessions, it's on my grant. Like, so we have done things like that. It's been very effective, but also very healing for themselves too. Because it allows to move on, but also move on with a tool. So it's not only you writing your paper, it's providing a tool for people to move forward and help others too.
For me, it's been the goals of my oral histories is to make the stories of the community that I'm learning from and that I'm a part of more widely known. Just beyond like simple narratives, like beyond that one sentence or one footnote that you'll find in a book, right? So when I share my interview transcripts with my interviewees, sometimes it's also beneficial because they'll read it over and they say, "Oh, wait, I think I got that wrong. This is what I meant to say," or "No, actually, I thought about this, and you might want to contact this person or that person." So then it goes into a snowball kind of situation. And I remember in one interview, I was talking to someone, and they were telling me, "You should actually write down the names of this person, that person. I'll give you their phone numbers after our interview is done, so you can contact because they know more about this topic than I do." So when I go to read the transcripts, sometimes I've found stuff that could potentially, lead to some tensions because it offers a divergence of opinions on a number of topics, or hearsay about an individual here or there. So as a historian, you're always trained, find the documented evidence that this happened. Look for meeting minutes that may be saved somewhere, or go to the main city newspaper. But in my case was I can't really trust the main city newspaper because part of the reason why the community was mobilizing was because the main city newspaper wasn't really talking about the community in a positive way. Yeah. They only talk about the negative aspects of the community. So I can't rely on them. I can rely on them to give like additional context here and there. My primary sources were the newspapers that many of my interviewees participated in. And in some cases, the newspapers corroborated what they were saying. But I also understand that sometimes what a person remembers is very different from what somebody else might remember, even though they were in the same context, same situation. And that's one of the beauties of oral history. You can have different perspectives about something. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is wrong. It's that you get a much richer, fuller picture. And you don't necessarily need that documented evidence to say, yes, it did happen, because that's a very Western type of mode of thought, that you need to have the written word. You need to have a visual thing to make sure that, yes, it did happen. No. Well, before all of that, there were other ways of recording and preserving memory, and passing that knowledge down from generation to generation is as effective and proven as any written document you could find. So for me, sharing the transcripts, has been also a way to make sure that I, get my interviewees' thoughts correctly. There was a time where in an interview we were talking about a specific individual who, let's just call him, was very controversial in the community, and we didn't mention the person by name in the interview, but I knew who my interview was talking about, so I just wrote the name on the paper and just showed it to him. And he was just not like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Did I include that in my dissertation? No. Am I thinking of including that in the manuscript? No, because it is beyond the point. Mm-hmm. It's more of like knowledge to have and to have a bigger picture of the story. But is that what readers want to learn? They don't want to learn about gossip or chisme around the community. The story is about what this community was doing. Not about, sometimes talking about the tensions and infighting within a social justice movement is relevant, because you want to see social movements as human. They also have their faults. Human beings lead them, and human beings make mistakes. And that's how we learn about some of the tensions that occurred over civil rights movements. So some of that I do include in there. But when I know that it's comments or ideas that are more about attacking a person directly, I refrain from putting that in there, because that's what I'm not interested in doing that. I don't intend on smearing anybody's name or reputation, and it's not going to add anything to what I'm trying to contribute. Is that I just want to contribute more to what has the ethnic Mexican experience been in the United States, or particularly in Southern California, and talking about whether somebody was cheating on somebody else. Like, it's not necessarily something that is important. It might be for a good conversation among the interviewees, but for me, it's like that's not what I'm there for. So when doing the interviews, there's been a moment, actually, just to quickly recap, I had an interview with somebody, and the person told me right off the bat, what I have to say you may not necessarily agree with. This was somebody who was coming from somebody on a different side of the political spectrum as I am. I still sat down. I listened to what they had to say. There were a few times where the person was making some comments that were offensive. I made sure to pause the recording, even though the person wasn't telling me that. I paused it, because that's not something that I'm interested in learning about in doing that. So it was a good conversation. We respect that we have different political views here and there. But again, those were examples of I don't want to talk so much about some of the beef that existed between people, more so just the larger story that you are a part of.
I guess I'll just add for the podcasting stuff, since that's part of why I'm here, this is a student podcast. We're not making money or anything off of this. But nonetheless, we are trying to create something that's engaging for the public. So I hesitate to use the word entertaining, but we try to make it like a compelling listening experience for whoever's listening. And so, there's plenty of podcasts out there that are like a really intellectually stimulating long form interview where you just hear two people talking, and that can be done really well. But what I try to get the students to consider doing, which is a kind of a podcast format that I find really compelling, is to present themselves as kind of like a protagonist in a story where they are trying to learn more about a particular topic that they don't know a lot about, and the listener is kind of embodying them in the episode and going on this quest with them to talk to people and get more information. And so, I try to have them record themselves trying to recruit people to talk to them. Of course, if they say no, then we don't include that in the episode, but that can sometimes be interesting to listen to, is have people go out and try to talk to someone and say, hey, approach someone on the quad, for example. Can you talk to me about, AI and how you use it? And hearing that kind of interaction can also be interesting for the listener to see how, how much of a struggle it is to recruit people for interviews themselves. So the goals, I think, can be very different in how we approach it.
Yeah. So I actually just wanted to ask one last question before, because I was hoping to let us ask a few questions too. And that was actually about handling sensitive information, especially in tense political times. Those questions of how you handle sensitive topics, whether it's in terms of legality, whether it's in terms of trauma, advice, or...
There are rules that like a lot of newsrooms will have about how to handle sensitive information. Like, most newsrooms will have a blanket policy. Like, if you interview a victim of like sexual assault, as an example, they will not be named in a story. You know, like they will be an anonymous source if they're willing to talk to you. Now, some might say, no, I want you to include my name. Like, I want to like be the voice that like steps forward, or something like that. And then maybe that could be discussed, but usually a newsroom will have like a policy that's like protected, but also even protecting persons of interest in like a crime as an example too, because you're also innocent until proven guilty, right? So like you can we see it time and time again where someone is like prematurely convicted in the media before they've ever stood trial. So you have to be careful on the other side too. I think also showing up like at the scene of an accident as an example. Sometimes journalists get there before first responders do, and you're a human being first, a journalist second. I will never forget, I had a professor once tell me a story about coming to a scene of a car accident that she was covering. And there was like a little boy who had like, his mother was in a car accident and he was like wandering in traffic while like emergency responders were like taking care of his mother. And so she went and took care of the child instead of doing the interviews, or like, you know, getting an idea of the scene. So you should be a human being first. But then I think, you know, there's interviewing strategies when you're talking to someone who's talking about something sensitive. Often like the people who've like either lost a family member or a victim of something, like I've been the journalist who's shown up and talked to family members after like their niece or daughter went missing. Like I had to do like a couple missing, like I did a missing little girl's case once. And like, you know, I'm talking to people on like the worst day of their lives, and you know, there's times where they don't want to talk to you, and that's okay. Like, you know, you can excuse yourself and be like, you know what, here's my card, let's talk another time. But also there's really powerful moments like with those times of sensitivity that like, they just want to tell someone's story. I also interviewed a woman once, and like kind of going back to the setting, like it's also, you know, these are people maybe inviting you into their homes, and sometimes it's valuable. Like, you know, don't just like ask someone to come to meet you at a Starbucks. Like you should go to them and like see them in their environment. Yeah. I interviewed a woman and her husband once who they lost 2 children under the age of 2. And so like I went to their home, I sat on their couch, I cried with them as they were telling me the story. Like they showed me like the nursery where their children were. She lost them both to SIDS, and like we're starting a nonprofit because of it. But like, you know, that was one of the most meaningful interviews I've ever had, because like they were willing to be so vulnerable and tell me their story. And I want to do that story justice because of how vulnerable they were. Mm-hmm. So, you know, being a human being is important, but you know, and connecting with them and like say like, hey, like, you know, if you're going to like a victim's home or something, don't ask them the same questions. So like every other person is asking, like, be like, no, I want to tell the person you loved's story. Like, tell me about them, versus saying like, you know, how do you feel that this just awful thing just happened to you? Yeah. And you might have to ask those hard questions, but like planning when you ask them matters. Like if you're going to go into like a jail and interview someone who has been convicted of a crime, and like, let's say they murdered someone, your first question would be like, why'd you do it? You know, they're automatically going to be like, go away, you know, or like if you have a really hard question that you have to ask, you should plan strategically when you ask that question, because it's about halfway through the interview, you know, because that way if they go, no, I don't want to answer, you can, but it's really important that you ask it. You can say like, hey, like later, you know, I know you don't want to answer that question, but like, it's really important that we talk about it. You know, obviously this is a question that people don't want to know the answer to, you know, so you have time. But also if it's halfway through and they get up and leave the conversation because you asked that question, you still have everything beforehand. So you just have to kind of balance, so, you know, it's important to be a human being. as a journalist, we're supposed to be unbiased. We're not supposed, like, I can't, like, necessarily treat, I can't, give favor to a member of the community over, like, someone in power. But at the end of the day, the goal is to tell the truth first and foremost. So, like, if someone is lying, you call them out on it. If someone's doing something oppressive, you call them out on it. But, like, because we are the voice for the community, we, like, give them information that they can plan and negotiate their lives around or their voting decisions around. So it's a really powerful thing. And so we have to make sure that we're doing it in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my case specifically, also is thinking about whenever you're in the beginning stages of a project, thinking about the topic and how the topic benefits the population the most. Like, also sometimes it's doing like kind of pre-research. So, for example, around, I don't know, this illness, what patients need from that, like, besides what's publishable as a researcher, right? Because that's the debate. People might be needing, for example, tools to eat more healthy or avoid or do preventive care or cope with their chronic illness in a better way because they don't have resources, but there's resources in papers that they cannot read 30 papers but those can be translated into tips, activities, routines, health behaviors in topics of health. So it's also talking to the people that's embodying the pain or having the issue, how you envision, like, the desire-centered approach. Like, what do you want to live? How would you like to face this difficulty? Or how do you want the story to be told, right? So in science, communications are complicated things because you work with the data of researchers and say, like, this is mine, right? But people is like, okay, yeah, for me, AI is important for this or for that. But the others, no, like, we have to talk about the interface and all this complicated data because I invested millions of dollars. And no, people don't want to know that. They want to know how they don't get crazy with the robots online, right? Like, they just want to know, like, until what point is healthy to ask questions to ChatGPT? Like, what's the boundary? Okay, what information should I be sharing in my iPhone when these new applications come? What is healthy? What's not healthy? So, okay, how you do those translational science applications and interventions with that? So it's kind of like, okay, this is what the researchers are doing, but this is actually what engages people, what people is needing to know that already has a solution, but nobody knows about it, right? So it's negotiating that point. But in topics of trauma, it's more complicated. I think you have to also acknowledge what's the problem, the reproduction of the problem over and over. So, for example, when I work with groups of activist feminists in Latin America, we're constantly doing work through our grassroots organizations, and the initiatives we do are copycat, like benchmark by people that has political means or want to appropriate our ideas, that have higher levels of privilege, and they have the money and the social capital to get the best of it. And they steal our ideas that have been from our abuelas or great tias that we have been doing for 30 years, and that later on they turn on into these influencers or politicians with our ideas, with things we did for many years. So how we avoid this appropriation? Plus, when we advocate for ourselves, they were saying things such as, they throw us these trolls online, figure out where we're living, bully us in public, and we want a solution for this. How we overcome this issue and protect our work. So there was lots of trauma in the middle, lots of issues in the middle. So providing resources, okay, if this happened to you, did you did something? Yes. Did you didn't know? Okay, what are things they can do, but also connecting with people that can help them beyond what you do. Like, I'm just like a social scientist with background in Stratcom and ScienceCom. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a lawyer, but I can find the resources that are work for that. So it's like, hey, if you want to move forward, it's up to you. Give them the agency. But for our work, we're going to make this thing happen, and what about this format so it's more widespread so other grassroots groups doesn't suffer this? They're like, okay, great, okay, like, and make people participate. So it was a beautiful experience after we created this online training, how to protect themselves in social media and other things. But also they did the artwork for it. So it's actually a beautiful piece that is passed on from person to person in WhatsApp groups, in digital spaces and stuff. And it's really helpful, but it works for them. So how we navigate those difficulties, but also how to allow people to move on. So how you become a meaningful piece in their stories to move on for what happened to them.
Because of the topics I teach, I always have to be conscious of the political background. There might be that one semester something that I'm teaching about makes oral history something a really good way to learn more in-depth stories about a particular topic, and there's other semesters where I have to sit down and think about, is oral history something I want to do now because of the potential consequences that might arise from interviewing? Just to give you a quick example, so I teach an immigration history class. And in the past, the final project has always been for students to interview an immigrant who's at least a generation older than they are, to learn about their experiences and understand what it's like what was the process like to immigrate to the United States, initial experiences, their thoughts, and what can you learn from that experience? You can't tell all of immigration history in 16 weeks, so the oral history projects are a good way for the students to be able to teach each other and teach me as well about different immigrants' experiences in the U.S. Moving forward, because of just how dangerous the political moment is, I'm considering maybe not doing oral histories because there might be people who are not willing to share their stories because they fear of a potential consequence that might arise from that, and two, I also don't want to put anybody in that potential danger, or students as well, given the uncertainty of things that are developing as we speak. So I've always had that political background in the back of my mind. So I have to go with what's going on. So I have to keep my eyes on the news whenever I can, and make sure that what I do is going to be safe for the community and for the students as well. And I mean, there's other ways to learn about community histories, immigration histories, and I can always rely on existing oral histories that were done 5, 10, 15 years ago. They can offer us insights there. I can share my own experiences as well from interviews that I've done in the past. But for students to do their own interviews, I need to carefully assess what are the potential benefits and consequences of doing that in the current moment.
I would just I would second the mechanical recommendation of putting hard questions in the middle of the interview. I think that's effective. And then having resources and just always reminding your respondent that you can stop at any time, that they can withdraw from the interview even after the interview has been completed. I think those are helpful reminders in those moments when they're sharing a traumatic story. And to just always, when you're writing interview questionnaires, ask yourself, why am I asking this question? What are you trying to get out of it? So there's an ethical consideration there. Like, are you just asking them to tell a traumatic story just because, or is there a reason for that? So, that's what I would say.
I like how much of the conversation has really grappled with questions of power in pragmatic ways and meaningful ways. The elements of strategy, how to actually think about the kinds of questions to ask, the order in which to ask questions. in terms of timing, I was actually going to go ahead and draw it to a close, and then maybe actually like that in terms of if people had questions after. Does that sound so? Because we're kind of at time here, but I really wanted to just thank our panelists, thank everyone who came out, and just all of that.